series of online lectures to continue throughout the spring semester for human anatomy and physiology. And this is in compliance with COVID-19 guidance of social distancing, and so you know that every class is now going to go online. So we're going to go on and move on using our textbook, which is the Fundamentals of Human Anatomy and Physiology. That's actually chapter 11. Last week you had your test on the muscles. Your grade should have been posted by now. So let's take a look at the next chapter on the nervous system. In this chapter you will learn that neurons send electrical signals along their entire length and communicate using chemical signals. So how do we do that? We learn by asking, how does the nervous system do and how is it organized? And then we take a look at what are the cells of the nervous system. So we look at the neuroglial cells and the neurons, and we move on and ask, how do neurons send electrical signals? And we take a closer look at the resting membrane potential. And by doing that, we ask, how do graded potentials act as short distance signals, and how do action potentials act as long distance signals? And how do neurons, then we get into how neurons send and receive chemical signals. And so we take a look at the synapse, the postsynaptic potential, the neurotransmitters and the receptors, and finally we sum it all up by asking, how do neurons work together? So, the nervous system has basic functions. It is the one that is the master controller and communicator, and it's a communicating system of the body. The cells communicate via electrical and chemical signals. They are rapid and they are really very specific, and they usually cause almost immediate response. And the nervous system goes around and integrates itself using several inputs. The first one is the sensory input. This is the information gathered by sensory receptors about internal and external changes. And right here, your receptor here, which will be your eyes, will be receiving signals from this object right here. You are looking at this object here, and it is gathered right through the sensory neuron, and it's now going to get into the integrating center right here, which you can see at the central nervous system. It is now the processing and interpretation, where the processing and interpretation of the sensory input will happen. And finally, you have a motor output, which will be activating the effector organs, the muscles and the glands, to produce a response. And right here, your response was to pick up the object, which is a glass of water. So, let's take a look further at the organization of the nervous system. The nervous system is divided into the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. The central nervous system is made up of the brain and the spinal cord, and these are the integration and control centers. They interpret sensory input and dictates motor outputs. The peripheral nervous system, on the other hand, is a portion of the nervous system that is outside of the central. So you could see all of these fibers here. Those are the ones that are part and parcel of your peripheral nervous system. It's made up of nerves that extend from the brain, okay, and from the spinal cord. So pretty much these are what you call the spinal nerves. These are the ones that come off your spinal cord, and cranial nerves are the ones that come off the brain. Let's move on and take a closer look at a better view of this organization. And right here, you have an organizational chart. You have your central nervous system. The brain and spinal cord is all the way at the top, and is the one that integrates and controls everything else. And it moves into the peripheral nervous system. And the peripheral nervous system will be your cranial nerves and the spinal nerves. And they are the communication lines between the central nervous system and the rest of the body right here. All right. So from there, you have two sections. You have the section that brings information into this. You have that section of the peripheral nervous system that brings information up into the central nervous system. These will be your sensory. And in the sensory, you have somatic and visceral sensory nerve fibers. They conduct impulses from the receptors to the central nervous system. And right here, you have your motor division. These would now be conducting impulses from your central nervous system down to the effector organs, the muscles, and the glands. And we divide this motor or effector division again into two. You have your somatic nervous system, which is voluntary. These are the voluntary motor nerves. They conduct impulses from the central nervous system to the skeletal muscles. And then you have the autonomic nervous system. This will be your involuntary motor and nerve fibers. They conduct impulses from the central nervous system to the cardiac muscles, the smooth muscles, and the glands. They are, of course, involuntary in nature, nothing that you can control. Okay, and they're made up of the sympathetic division, which mobilizes the body system during activity, and then your parasympathetic division that conserves energy and promotes housekeeping functions during rest. And so what are the cells of the nervous system? We're now going to get into the cells. And finally, we have two principal types of cells, which will be your neuroglial cells. These are the helper cells. Glia means space. They are very small, but the neuroglial cells outnumber a neuron 50,000 to 1. So you could just imagine how much of them is in our nervous system just to protect the neurons. And the neurons need that protection because these are the chief excitable cells that transmit electrical signals. So what are the neuroglial cells? There are four main neuroglial cells that is in the central nervous system. You have the astrocytes, the microglial cells, the ependymal cells, and the oligodendrocytes. Let's take them one by one. The astrocytes are star-shaped. You could see them star-shaped, and they're hanging on to capillaries, okay, and processes of neurons. They're very abundant. They're very versatile and highly branched glial cells. They cling to neurons, synaptic endings, and capillaries. The astrocytes' functions would include to support and raise the neurons. They play a role in exchanges between capillaries and neurons. As a matter of fact, this is actually the astrocyte makes the blood-brain barrier or supports the blood-brain barrier, and they guide the migrations of young neurons. They control chemical environment around the neurons. They respond to nerve impulses and neurotransmitter, and they influence neuronal functioning. They also participate in information processing in the brain. And here's your microglial cell after the astrocyte. Microglia are actually differentiated white blood cells. They pretty much have committed to become part of the brain. Then they serve there as a microglia or as helper cells to the neuron. They're small, ovoid cells with thorny processes that touch and monitor neurons. They migrate towards the injured neurons, and then they can transform to phagocytized microorganisms and neuronal debris, much like a regular white blood cell or a regular soldier would. And then finally, you have the ependymal cells. The ependymal cells, well, this is not the last, this is the third one. They range in shape from squamous to columnar, and you could see that they look like they're covering the surface, some surfaces that are in the brain and spinal cord. They are ciliated, and therefore they are covering fluid-filled cavities in the central nervous system. And they have cilia that would be beating in order to circulate this fluid, which is really nothing but your cerebrospinal fluid. And they line the central cavities of the brain and the spinal column. They form permeable barrier between the cerebrospinal fluid in cavities and tissues fluid bathing the central nervous system cells. So finally, you have now your oligodendrocytes. The last, but not the least, they are branch cells. They protect and wrap central nervous system nerve fibers, forming insulated myelin sheets in thicker nerve fibers. And you could just see that these oligodendrocytes will hold together, will cling on to several axons. Those yellow bars are axons of neurons, and they hold them together. So they are more or less organizing them, so they're not going to be all over the place. So that's exactly how the helper cells are in the central nervous system. What about the peripheral nerves? What are the neuroglial cells of the peripheral nervous system? Well, there's only two of them. And first one is your satellite cells. They surround neuronal bodies in the peripheral nervous system. Their function is very similar to the astrocyte of the central nervous system. And then the second one will be your neurolimocytes, or the Schwann cells. They surround all peripheral nerve fibers and form myelin sheets in thicker nerve fibers. Their function is similar to the oligodendrocytes. They're very vital to the regeneration of damaged and peripheral nerve fibers. And they are also very vital to speeding up the transmission of nerve impulses in an axon. And here, this is actually your satellite cells, and you could see it surrounding the cell body of a unipolar neuron. This is a unipolar neuron right here. And then right here, the axons, okay, will be, you could see them being wrapped by the Schwann cells and forming myelin sheets around the axons of this unipolar neuron. So that's the end, guys, and we're now going to get into our next topic. I'm going to end it from here.